How a single Confederate soldier's act of mercy at Appomattox influenced the war's final hours was the only thing my grandfather ever told me about his own time in the desert. And I didn't understand why he was crying until I spent my own first night in a sand-choked hole outside of Fallujah, staring at a man whose eyes were exactly the color of a dead radiator. It wasn't history that haunted him. It was the realization that mercy is a luxury that costs more than any man can afford when the sun goes down and the world turns into a series of flashes and thuds. I grew up in a town in Ohio where the biggest crisis was a power outage during a summer thunderstorm, and the most dangerous thing you could encounter was a deer on the highway at dusk. My dad worked at the plant, my mom kept the house running like a Swiss watch, and I spent my weekends fixing up an old Ford truck that rattled so hard it felt like it was trying to shake itself apart. We had this ritual, my grandfather and I, sitting on the back porch with the smell of wet grass and charcoal hanging in the humid air, him nursing a lukewarm beer, and me trying to figure out how to be a man without knowing what a man was supposed to be in a world that never seemed to demand anything more than showing up on time. He never talked about the war, not the big one or the one he'd been through, but he always talked about that moment in Virginia, about a boy in a ragged gray coat who stood up when he should have stayed down, who reached out a hand to an enemy instead of pulling a trigger, and how that one decision, that 1 second of hesitating, meant the difference between a life and a memory. I thought it was just a story. I thought it was a lesson about character. I didn't know then that character is just a fancy word for what you do when you are terrified and alone, and you realize that nobody is coming to tell you what the right answer is. I enlisted because I wanted to be part of something that mattered, or maybe just because I was tired of the monotony of a life that felt like it was being written in pencil on a page that was already getting smudged. I remember the recruiting office, the smell of floor wax and stale coffee, the air conditioning humming like a cicada, and the recruiter, a guy named Sergeant Miller who had a stare that made me feel like I was already standing in formation. He didn't promise me glory. He didn't promise me anything. He just looked at me and asked if I could follow orders even when they didn't make sense, and I said yes because I wanted to believe I was the kind of person who could. The bus ride to boot camp was the last time I felt like a civilian, a weird, detached transition where I sat next to a kid from Kentucky who wouldn't stop talking about his hunting dog, and a guy from Jersey who was reading a thick paperback and looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. We were all kids, really, wearing the same expressions of forced confidence that vanished the second we stepped off that bus and into the wall of noise that would define our existence for the next decade. The shouting wasn't about hate. It was about stripping away everything that made us individuals and replacing it with something harder, something that wouldn't shatter when the first real shockwave rolled through our lives. My first night in country, the heat didn't just sit on you, it claimed you. It was a physical weight, a thick, suffocating blanket that tasted like burnt oil and dust. We were at an FOB that was basically a collection of containers and concertina wire shoved into a landscape that looked like the moon if the moon had been hit by a wrecking ball. I shared a tent with 4 other guys, and that was when I met Henderson. Henderson was from a town in Alabama I couldn't find on a map even if you gave me a compass and a month, and he had this way of laughing at everything, even the stuff that should have made him curl up in a ball and quit. He'd sit on his cot, cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time that hour, and tell jokes about the food or the weather, or the way the brass looked at us like we were pieces of equipment that were slightly overdue for maintenance. It was dark humor, sure, but it was the kind of humor that kept the air moving. If we stopped laughing, we might have started thinking, and if we started thinking, we might have started feeling, and feeling was a dangerous thing to do when you were sleeping with your boots on and listening to the wind howl through the gaps in the plywood walls. We lived on MREs, bad coffee, and the shared knowledge that we were all in this together, even if we didn't know what this actually was yet. I loved them, those guys, in that quiet, unspoken way that feels more permanent than any friendship you find in the civilian world. You don't ask for permission to love someone when you're watching their back, and you don't need a name for the bond that forms when you've both stared into the same dark hole and decided not to jump. The missions began as a blur of checkpoints and long, grinding patrols where the most dangerous thing was the boredom. We'd walk through streets that felt like a movie set, the silence heavy with the knowledge that we were being watched by eyes we couldn't see. I remember the way the light hit the rubble at dusk, painting it in shades of orange and bruised purple, and how I'd find myself thinking about the backyard in Ohio, about how the lawnmower would be starting up around now, the sound drifting over the fence from a neighbor's house. I'd look over at Henderson, walking a few paces to my left, his jaw set, his eyes darting back and forth, and I'd realized that my world had shrunk down to the space between us and the dirt under our feet. We found a rhythm, a terrifying, beautiful, hollowed-out rhythm where we did our jobs. We kept our mouths shut, and we tried to ignore the fact that the space between us and home was widening every single day. I kept a letter from my girl tucked into my pocket, the paper soft and worn from the friction of my thumb, and reading it was the only time I felt like I could actually breathe, though even that felt like an intrusion, like I was bringing something too clean and too bright into a place that was built on gray and shadow. Tension in that part of the world doesn't announce itself. It just grows, like mold in a dark basement. It lived in the way we checked our gear, the way we didn't talk as much as we used to, and the way our hands would twitch toward our gear the moment a sound broke the routine. We knew something was coming. You can feel it in the air, a drop in the pressure, a stillness that is too heavy to be natural. It was as if the ground itself was holding its breath. We were heading out for a routine sweep of a sector that had been quiet for weeks, but the silence felt aggressive. Henderson was walking point, his silhouette small against the rising sun, and I remember looking at his boots, caked in that fine, pale dust that never really comes off, and thinking that he walked with the kind of steady, unbothered grace that only comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. He turned back and flashed me a grin, that same lopsided, effortless grin that made you feel like everything was going to be fine, like we were just kids out for a hike. And I remember the way the light caught his helmet, a sharp, metallic glint that seemed to stop time for a heartbeat. We reached the edge of the village, a cluster of mud brick walls and narrow alleys that smelled of wood smoke and rot. It was quiet, too quiet. Even the dogs had gone to ground. We stopped at a junction where the road split, the dirt packed hard under our treads. I saw Henderson freeze. He didn't drop, he just stopped, his posture shifting from fluid motion to rock-hard rigidity. He signaled for us to stay low, his hand sharp and decisive against the hazy sky. I followed his eyes toward a doorway about 30 yards ahead, where a shadow was moving. It wasn't a soldier. It wasn't a threat that you could train for. It was a person, a kid, maybe 10 years old, standing there in the dirt, hands raised, eyes wide with a terror so pure it made my chest ache. Henderson didn't look at me. He didn't look at the rest of the squad. He just looked at that kid, and for a second, the entire war, the mission, the orders, the weight of the last 6 months, all of it just dissolved into the space between them. He took a step forward, his weapon lowered, not out of stupidity, but out of something that belonged to a different time, a different code, something like the mercy my grandfather talked about, the act that breaks the rules of the game because the game itself has stopped mattering. I saw him reach into his vest, his movements slow and deliberate, and the tension in my gut twisted into something sharper, something that felt like a warning that the air was about to catch fire. He was looking at that boy, and I was looking at Henderson, and behind him, the wall was starting to ripple with the heat of the coming day. He moved his hand, and I think he was reaching for a piece of gum or a picture, some scrap of humanity to bridge the gap, but the world didn't give us the luxury of the exchange. A sound, small and sharp, cut through the quiet, and Henderson's shoulders hitched. He didn't fall right away. He just stood there for a second, looking confused, like he'd forgotten what he was doing or why he was standing in the dirt, and then he crumpled, folding inward like a piece of paper. The air erupted. It was a physical thing, a wall of noise and pressure that slammed into us and sent the world spinning into a chaotic, shrieking blur of motion and color. I hit the ground, my face pressing into the grit, the heat of the earth soaking into my skin, and the only thing I could think, the only thought that managed to cut through the roar, was that I was still holding the picture of my girl in my pocket, and it was the most ridiculous, beautiful, impossible thing to be holding while the world was coming apart. I didn't move. I couldn't move. My brain was stuck on the way Henderson had looked right before the noise started, the way his eyes had softened when he saw that boy, and I felt the cold, hard weight of a realization that was so heavy it felt like it would pull me into the center of the earth. The screaming started then, a sound that wasn't human, a raw, jagged edge of agony that cut through the thunder of the exchange. I remember the smell, the sudden, sharp, metallic tang of blood mixing with the dust, and the way the light seemed to turn a sickly, bruised shade of gray. I was waiting for orders, waiting for someone to tell me how to fix it, how to reach back and undo the last 10 seconds, but the radio was just static, a frantic, meaningless chatter that had nothing to do with what was happening in the dust. I looked up just for a second and saw the doorway was empty. The boy was gone. The street was empty. It was just us and the dust and the silence that was beginning to bleed back into the space after the explosions. I tried to crawl toward Henderson, but my legs felt like lead, like they weren't attached to me anymore, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that was more terrifying than the fire, that I was going to be here forever. I was going to be in this patch of dirt, watching the dust settle on his uniform for the rest of my life. The squad was moving around me, shadows shifting in the periphery of my vision, but they were miles away, operating in a different reality where decisions still had outcomes and actions still had logic. I wasn't in that reality anymore. I was in the place where the mercy lived, the place where the only thing left was the weight of the man who had tried to be something else, and the cold, terrifying knowledge that he had been punished for it. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just lay there, listening to the sound of my own heart hammering against the hard-packed earth, a rhythmic, frantic drumbeat that sounded like a countdown to absolutely nothing at all. The last thing I heard was the sound of a distant, lonely bird, a sound that didn't belong in this place, a sound that made me realize that the world was still spinning, even though ours had stopped. I closed my eyes, and for a second I wasn't in the desert. I was back on that porch in Ohio, the smell of charcoal and wet grass filling my lungs, my grandfather's voice steady and low as he told me about a boy in a gray coat who stood up when he should have stayed down. I knew what happened next. I knew exactly what happened next, and I didn't want to open my eyes to see it. The sound of that bird stopped, and the silence that rushed back in was so heavy it felt like it was pressing the breath right out of my lungs. I finally forced my eyes open, and the world had turned into a grayscale photograph, everything washed out in the pale, choking dust kicked up by the blast. Henderson was maybe 10 feet away from me, lying on his side like he was just taking a break in the middle of a long walk, his rifle discarded in the dirt a few inches from his reach. There wasn't any heroics. There wasn't a final speech or a dramatic movie moment where he reached for my hand and told me to live for the both of us. He was just gone, his chest still, his face turned toward the doorway where that kid had been standing seconds before. I remember the way the fabric of his uniform was torn, the dark, wet stain spreading across the shoulder, and how oddly clean his boots looked compared to the rest of the ruins surrounding us. I crawled toward him, the gravel biting into my palms, my movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a puppet with tangled strings. My head was ringing so hard I couldn't hear my own ragged breathing, only a high-pitched whine that wouldn't quit. I reached him and just sat there, my hands hovering over his vest, not knowing where to put them, feeling like if I touched him I'd break the last piece of him that still felt real. The rest of the guys were screaming orders, their voices sounding like they were coming from underwater, muffled and distant. Miller was yelling something about a perimeter, his face a mask of rage and sweat, but none of it registered as part of my world. To me, the universe had shrunk down to the 4 inches of space between my knee and Henderson's hip. I leaned in, my ear close to his face, expecting to hear a whisper or a final breath, but there was nothing except the wind whistling through a hole in a nearby wall. I reached out and touched his dog tags, the metal cold and biting, and I felt a jolt go through my entire frame. A shock of realization that the person who, only minutes ago, had been making a joke about the texture of our breakfast bars was now just a collection of mass and cooling heat. I wanted to laugh. It was a sick, rising pressure in my throat, a hysterical need to crack a joke about the ridiculousness of it all, because the alternative was to let the reality in, and I knew that if I did, I would never stand up again. I felt the weight of my own weapon pressing against my hip, a useless piece of steel, and I wondered if he had even realized what was happening before the sound arrived. Did he know he was dying, or was he still thinking about that kid, still trying to offer that piece of himself? A mortar round impacted somewhere down the street, sending a fresh wave of debris showering over us, and I instinctively hunched over him, trying to shield him from the grit, a reflex born of nothing but habit. It was a stupid, pointless gesture. He didn't need shielding anymore. But I stayed there, curled into a ball over his body, feeling the vibration of the earth through my ribs. Miller slammed into the ground beside me, his eyes wild, his uniform shredded, and he grabbed my shoulder, shouting something in my ear. He was shaking me, demanding a status report, his face inches from mine, and I looked at him and couldn't find the words. The vocabulary of my life had evaporated. I pointed at Henderson, my hand shaking so hard it looked like I was waving, and Miller's expression hardened, his eyes flicking to the body and then back to me, the anger replaced by a hollow, terrifying vacancy. He didn't say sorry. He didn't say anything. He just squeezed my shoulder, a grip so tight it bruised the bone, and then he was moving again, barking orders into a radio that had gone silent, his voice cracking with a strain he couldn't hide. I stayed where I was. I felt like if I stood up, the gravity would lose its grip, and I'd just drift away into the hazy, orange sky. The afternoon dragged on in a series of disjointed, feverish flashes. There was more gunfire, more shouting, more of that soul-crushing, rhythmic thud of mortars hitting the outskirts of the sector. I remember helping move him, the weight of him feeling impossibly heavy, like he was made of lead and broken dreams. We put him on a makeshift litter, the canvas tearing at the corners, and I remember the sound of it, a soft, dry ripping noise that seemed to echo for miles. I watched his head loll to the side, his hair matted with dust, and I had to look away because the sight of it was clawing at my insides, tearing at things I didn't even know I was holding onto. We didn't talk. Nobody had the breath for it. We were like ghosts moving through a graveyard, our motions efficient and mechanical, stripped of the human mess that usually sat behind our actions. I caught myself thinking about the letter in my pocket again, the ink probably smeared by the sweat and the dirt, and I felt a flash of pure, unadulterated shame. I was alive. I was going to read that letter again. I was going to be the one who had to hold the memory of this, the one who had to carry the way he looked at that kid while he was buried in a box and forgotten by a world that didn't even know his name. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the debris. Everything turned that deep, bruised purple that signifies the end of another day in a place that seemed to exist only to consume us. We were back at the FOB, sitting on the edge of the containers, the air thick with the smell of diesel and the metallic tang of the day's work. I was sitting on a crate, staring at the dust on my boots, watching it shift and settle with every breath I took. Someone brought coffee, a plastic cup of brown, lukewarm sludge that tasted like burnt plastic, and I drank it because it was something to do with my hands. I looked around the yard at the other guys. They were sitting in similar postures, hunched quiet, their faces drawn and gray, the kind of exhaustion that isn't physical but something much deeper, something that settles into the marrow of your bones. I saw Miller standing by the gate, his back to us, staring out into the void where the sun had just vanished. He hadn't shaved, and the stubble on his jaw made him look older than he could possibly be, a man who had seen his own life pass by and wasn't impressed by what he'd found. I kept expecting someone to come and explain it, to come and tell us that this was a mistake, a miscalculation, that we could pack up and head back to the start. But the world kept moving. A transport vehicle rolled in, its engine growling like a wounded beast, and men started unloading supplies, crates of ammo and food, their movements businesslike and unbothered by the fact that the sky had essentially fallen on us a few hours prior. The surreal nature of it, the way the base continued to function, the way the paperwork would be filed, the way the reports would be written, felt like a slap in the face. I wanted to scream at them, to grab them by the vests and force them to look at what we had lost, but I knew that even if I did, they'd just blink and keep moving. We were the only ones who knew. We were the only ones who saw the look in Henderson's eyes, the moment he decided to reach out, the way the dust had settled on his shoulders when he hit the ground. That was our secret now, a burden we had to carry back to the dark, quiet corners of our own heads. Night settled in, cold and sharp, the stars appearing in the sky like distant, uncaring eyes. I lay on my cot, staring at the plywood ceiling, listening to the wind howl through the gaps in the frame. I didn't want to close my eyes. Every time I did, I saw the doorway. I saw the kid. I saw Henderson's hand moving toward his vest, reaching for that scrap of humanity that had ended up being his undoing. It was a loop, a never-ending cycle of the same 3 seconds, played over and over in the theater of my mind. I wondered if he was scared in those final moments, or if he was just surprised. I wondered if he thought it was worth it. I wondered if the kid was still out there, hiding in the dark, or if he was gone, swallowed up by the same machine that had chewed us up and spat us out. The questions were like jagged glass, cutting me every time I turned my thoughts toward them. I reached into my pocket and touched the letter again, the paper soft and fragile under my fingertips. I didn't take it out. I didn't have the strength to look at it. I just held it, trying to ground myself in the only reality I had left, a piece of home that felt like it belonged to a different man, a man who had been stupid enough to think he was a hero. The morning came too fast, a pale, sickly light that filtered through the tent flaps and illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. I sat up, my joints aching, my body feeling like it had been through a car wreck. I looked across at the empty cot where Henderson used to sleep. It was perfectly made, tight corners, everything in its place, like he had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any second with a joke about the coffee or the brass. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, a physical void where the laughter should have been. I stood up and walked outside. The air was still cool, the scent of morning dew and exhaust hanging heavy. I saw Miller by the transport, his face composed, his uniform crisp and clean. He looked at me, and there was a flicker of something behind his eyes, a recognition of the shared space we were now occupying, a silent acknowledgement that we were both walking wounded, dragging our ghosts around behind us. He didn't speak. He just nodded, a slight, sharp movement of his head, and then he turned back to the logistics of the day. The routine had to continue. The patrol had to go out. The sector had to be secured. The machine didn't stop for the dead, and it certainly didn't stop for the ones who had to keep living. I started checking my gear, my hands moving with a fluid, practiced precision that felt disconnected from the chaos in my brain. I checked my magazines, the weight of them familiar and reassuring, my fingers tracing the edges of the metal. I was doing it, but I wasn't really there. I was a shell, a set of reflexes designed to survive until the next shift, the next mission, the next moment of terror that would undoubtedly be waiting for us around the next corner. I looked down at my boots, the same pair I'd been wearing the day before, and I saw the dried blood, a dark, crusty stain on the leather, and I realized with a sickening thud that I hadn't washed it off. I stood there, staring at that stain, and I felt the urge to sit down in the dirt and never move again. But the order came down, a sharp, crisp command that cut through the morning, and my legs moved before I even told them to. I fell into line with the rest of the guys, a row of shadows moving toward the trucks, our faces blank, our eyes fixed on the horizon. We were just men doing a job, a group of survivors walking through a landscape that didn't know our names and didn't care if we ever made it back to the other side. The heat began to rise, a shimmering wave that blurred the lines between the earth and the sky. We were in the back of the transport, the metal vibrating against my spine, the smell of oil and sweat and unwashed bodies a constant reminder of where we were and what we were supposed to be doing. I stared out the back, watching the landscape roll by, the mud brick walls and the dirt roads turning into a blur of brown and gray. I found myself thinking about Ohio again, about the way the trees looked in the fall, the vibrant oranges and reds, the smell of damp leaves and wood smoke. It felt like a dream, a memory from a life that belonged to someone else, someone who hadn't seen what I had seen, someone who hadn't stood in the dirt and watched a brother stop breathing. The transition was so complete that I didn't even recognize the person I had been before the desert, the kid who had thought that enlisting was about finding something that mattered. I had found it all right. I had found the bottom of the well, the place where the definitions of courage and cowardice blurred into the same gray, messy reality. We arrived at the patrol point, the same junction where everything had gone sideways the day before. The area was marked by the churned-up earth, the jagged craters, the scattered remains of the day's violence. It was a graveyard now, a monument to a moment that had passed, and yet we were walking right back into it, our boots crunching on the glass and the stone. I felt a surge of panic, a desperate, clawing need to turn around and run, but I kept my pace, my eyes scanning the ruins, my finger hovering just off the trigger. I was looking for him, for the kid. I didn't know why. I didn't know if I wanted to find him and kill him, or if I wanted to find him and offer him the same thing Henderson had tried to give. The confusion was a sharp, biting pain in my chest. I felt like I was being pulled in two different directions, a tug-of-war between the duty I had been trained for and the humanity that had been ripped out of me. The silence was absolute, save for the wind whistling through the gaps in the walls. It felt like the world was waiting for me to make a decision, to commit to one side or the other, but I didn't have an answer. I didn't have anything except the weight of my gear and the memory of that lopsided, effortless grin. We pushed forward into the alleyway, the darkness of the shadows clinging to us like a second skin. Every corner felt like a threat, every movement a potential spark for another explosion. My heart was a frantic, irregular drumbeat in my ears, the rhythm of a man who was walking on the edge of a blade. I saw Miller signal for a halt, his hand sharp and decisive against the hazy wall. I pressed my back against the mud, my breath catching in my throat, my eyes darting toward the doorway where the kid had stood. It was empty, a gaping hole of blackness that seemed to be watching me. I felt the familiar, cold, biting sensation of terror begin to creep up my spine, the way my body prepared for the end before my brain even had a chance to process the risk. I was waiting for the sound, the small, sharp crack that would signal the start of another nightmare, but the air remained still. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. It was just the silence, the overwhelming, crushing silence of a place that had already seen enough, a place that was holding its breath, waiting to see what we would do next. I felt the sweat trickling down my spine, the grit in my eyes, the weight of the rifle in my hands, and I realized that I was terrified, not just of what might happen, but of the fact that I was still here, still moving, still breathing, when I should have been nothing but a memory in the dirt. Miller signaled to clear the room, his movements sharp and efficient, a machine in human skin. We moved forward, our boots silent on the packed earth, our weapons leveled at the darkness. I crossed the threshold, my pulse hammering in my throat, my mind searching for the kid, for the threat, for the thing that had ruined my world. The room was small, sparse, a single rug on the floor, a stack of blankets in the corner. It was empty. There was nothing here but the smell of stale air and the lingering ghost of a life that had been lived on the edge of oblivion. I walked to the center of the room, my boots crunching on something, and I looked down. It was a toy, a small, crudely carved wooden animal, half buried in the dust. I reached down and picked it up, the wood smooth and worn from a child's hands, and I felt a sudden, crushing wave of grief that nearly brought me to my knees. It wasn't for the kid. It was for us. For the way we had all been broken, for the way the world had been stripped of its innocence, for the fact that this piece of wood was all that remained of the humanity we had left behind. I closed my eyes, the toy gripped tight in my hand, and I let the wave wash over me, the grief and the rage and the confusion mixing into a cocktail of pure, unadulterated suffering. I heard Miller behind me, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic, the sound of a man who had long ago stopped feeling the weight of the things he carried. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the toy in my hand, his expression unreadable, a mask of stone. He nodded toward the exit, a curt, dismissive motion, and we moved on, the rhythm of the patrol taking over, the mission demanding our presence. We left the room behind, left the toy in the dust, and walked back out into the blistering sun, the world returning to its cold, mechanical function. I walked with my head down, the weight of the toy still feeling like it was burning a hole in my pocket, the memory of Henderson's grin flashing in my mind every time I blinked. The road ahead was long, a winding, dusty scar through the earth that stretched out toward a horizon I couldn't see, and I knew, with the kind of certainty that only comes after the world has ended, that I would be walking this road for a long, long time. I was still here, still standing, still breathing, and that was the hardest, most brutal truth of all. The patrol continued for hours, a series of checkpoints and sweeps through neighborhoods that all looked exactly the same, a collection of mud walls, narrow streets, and the constant, gnawing threat of something hidden in the shadows. I was operating on autopilot, my body moving with a fluid, lethal grace that felt entirely separate from my mind. I didn't care anymore. The fear had burned itself out, replaced by a dull, aching numbness that was somehow worse. I wasn't scared of the bullets or the mortars or the hidden eyes or the things that lived in the dark. I was scared of the quiet. I was scared of the moments when the noise stopped and I was forced to face the reality of the empty space beside me. Henderson wasn't there. He would never be there again. And every time I turned to my left, expecting to see his steady, unbothered grin, the reality of that absence hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. It wasn't a sadness I could cry over. It was a void, a hole that was slowly consuming everything I had left of myself. We reached the edge of the sector, the point where the desert began, a vast, open expanse of nothingness that seemed to go on forever. Miller called for a rest, a brief pause to hydrate and reassess, and we collapsed into the shade of a crumbling wall, our gear clattering against the stones. I leaned back, my eyes fixed on the heat ripples dancing over the sand, my hands resting on my knees, my fingers twitching with a nervous energy I couldn't suppress. I pulled the letter from my pocket, the paper soft and worn, and for the first time in days I unfolded it. The words were blurry, the ink smeared by the sweat and the dirt, but I could still read them, the familiar, gentle handwriting, a lifeline in a world that was rapidly losing its shape. It was a note from my girl, a simple, sweet message about the weather back in Ohio, about how the trees were turning, about how she'd seen a cardinal in the backyard and thought of me. It was so small, so irrelevant, so incredibly bright compared to the darkness I was living in, and I felt a sudden, sharp pang of longing so intense it made my heart ache. I wanted to be there. I wanted to smell the damp leaves and hear the sound of the lawnmower and know that none of this had ever happened. I looked up and I saw Miller watching me. He didn't look away and he didn't offer any comfort. He just looked at the paper, then back at me, his eyes reflecting the same hollowed-out exhaustion that I knew was in my own. We were both ghosts, men who had left something behind in that dusty alleyway and weren't ever going to be able to reclaim it. He stood up, his gear rattling, his face fixed in that eternal, battle-hardened mask, and he signaled for us to move out. I folded the letter, tucked it back into my pocket, and stood up, my body protesting every movement. We fell into line, a row of shadows moving into the heat, the desert swallowing us whole. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see the place where Henderson had stood, the place where the world had changed forever. I just kept walking, my eyes fixed on the back of Miller's helmet, my feet moving in time with the rest of them, the rhythmic crunch of the gravel under our boots the only sound in the world. We walked until the sun was low and the shadows were long, the desert cooling under the fading light. Every step was an effort, a conscious, deliberate movement that required more focus than I felt I had left. I was waiting for something to happen, for the world to break again, for the silence to be shattered, but nothing came. It was just the wind, the heat, and the slow, grinding passage of time. I felt like I was being stretched, thin and fragile, as if the desert was trying to wear me down until there was nothing left but the dust. I thought about my grandfather, about the story he had told me on the porch, and I wondered if he had felt this, if he had carried this same weight for all those years, if the ghost of that boy in the gray coat had ever truly left him. I looked at the desert and realized that I was looking at a place that didn't care about mercy or sacrifice or the weight of the souls that had been lost here. It was a place of iron and dust, and it was going to outlast us all. I felt a sudden, sharp tremor in my hands, a jolt of pure, unadulterated adrenaline that hit me like a lightning strike. Miller had stopped. His hand was raised, his posture tense, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. We all froze, our training kicking in, our bodies shifting into defensive positions, our weapons coming up as one. The world seemed to stop, the wind dying down, the heat fading into the background. I looked where he was pointing, and I saw it, a figure, small and distant, standing on a dune watching us. It wasn't a soldier. It was a kid, the same age, the same build, the same air of quiet, unnerving stillness. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm that echoed in my ears. I felt a surge of rage, a hot, blinding fire that threatened to consume my reason, the urge to pull the trigger and end the uncertainty once and for all. I looked at Miller, and his expression was cold, a predator's focus, his finger tightening on the safety. I looked back at the kid, and for a second the entire history of the world seemed to narrow down to this one point, this one final, agonizing second where the choice was ours to make. The silence stretched, a taut, vibrating wire that threatened to snap. The kid didn't move. He stood there, a small, dark shape against the dying light, his eyes fixed on us with a stillness that was both innocent and entirely wrong. My hand was shaking, the rifle heavy in my grip, the weight of it feeling like a mountain. I was looking at Miller, I was looking at the kid, and I was remembering Henderson, the way he had reached out, the way he had tried to bridge the gap, the way his body had crumpled in the dirt. The choice was hanging there, suspended in the air between us, a massive, crushing weight that I knew I would have to carry for the rest of my life. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to be the person who pulled the trigger, and I didn't want to be the person who didn't. I was trapped, caught in the middle of a conflict that had no resolution, a war that wasn't being fought on a map but inside the hollowed-out spaces of our own souls. I watched Miller's finger. It was a tiny, infinitesimal movement, a shift in the balance of the universe. He was looking at the kid, and I saw a flicker of hesitation, a brief, fleeting moment of doubt that crossed his face before the mask slammed back down. He didn't fire. He didn't move. He just stared, his eyes tracking the kid's every move, his breath controlled and steady. The kid turned slowly, with a grace that felt almost unnatural, and walked away into the desert, his silhouette vanishing into the deepening twilight. We stayed there frozen, our weapons leveled at the empty space, our bodies screaming with the strain of the weight. The silence flooded back in, heavier than before, the weight of it pressing down on us until I thought I would break. We stood there for what felt like hours, the only sound the low, rhythmic sigh of the wind in the sand. I finally let my rifle drop, the weight of it pulling at my shoulder, my arms feeling like they were made of stone. Miller lowered his weapon, his expression unreadable, his eyes still fixed on the dune. He didn't speak. He just turned and signaled for us to move on, his movements slow, his demeanor suggesting a man who had seen the edge of the abyss and had decided that he was going to walk away from it, at least for tonight. We kept walking, the night air cooling as the darkness deepened, the stars appearing in the sky one by one. I felt a strange, hollowed-out sense of peace, the kind of quiet that follows a storm when the wreckage is still smoldering. We weren't the same men who had stepped off the transport that morning. We were thinner, harder, built out of the things we had survived and the things we had lost. I walked in the dark, my feet finding the rhythm of the march, my head spinning with the echoes of the last 2 days. I looked at the desert and realized that I was looking at a place that would never leave me, a piece of the world that had been carved into my skin and my spirit. I would carry this with me, into the nights and the silence and the years that lay ahead, and I knew, with the kind of clarity that only comes when you are standing on the brink, that I would never be able to explain it. Not to the people back home, not to the ones who were waiting, not even to myself. This was the war, the real one, the one that lived in the blood and the bone, the one that didn't end with a report or a medal or a bus ride home. It ended in the moments when the noise stopped, and you realized that you were the only one left to remember what it was like to be a man. I kept walking, my eyes fixed on the path ahead, my thoughts settling into the quiet, dark rhythm of the desert night. I thought about the letter in my pocket, the paper soft and fragile, and I felt a sudden, sharp need to read it again, not for the comfort it offered, but for the reminder of the life I had left behind. I knew even as I touched the edge of the paper that it was too late. That version of me was gone, lost in the dust and the heat and the fire of a place that had no room for someone who believed in the world as it used to be. I was a different man now, a creature forged in the furnace of survival, and I was going to have to find a way to live with the person I had become. The road stretched out before us, a long, winding scar through the earth, and as I walked, the sound of my own footsteps sounded like the beating of a heart that was just starting to remember how to live, even if it didn't know what it was living for. I walked on through the dark, through the cold, through the absolute, crushing weight of the things that could not be said, and for the first time since it started, I felt like I was moving towards something, even if that something was only the next step. The horizon began to lighten, a faint, gray glow spreading across the sand as the morning threatened to arrive. We were exhausted, our bodies sagging with the weight of the march, but we kept going, a row of ghosts moving through the pre-dawn light. I felt the familiar, gnawing ache in my chest, the reminder of all the things I had lost, but I also felt a strange flicker of something else, a small, persistent, stubborn hope that was still buried somewhere deep inside. It was there beneath the exhaustion and the horror and the guilt, a tiny spark of life that refused to be extinguished. I looked at the sky, the colors shifting from gray to orange, and I thought about the porch in Ohio, the smell of charcoal and wet grass, the sound of the lawnmower in the distance. It wasn't gone. It was waiting, somewhere on the other side of this, somewhere in a future that felt like a dream. I would get there or I would die trying, and either way the story wouldn't end here. The road was still under my feet, the sky was still above me, and as long as I could take the next step, there was a chance that I would make it through the fire and into the light. I walked on, the silence of the desert around me, the weight of the war in my blood, and for the first time I didn't look for the ghosts. I just looked at the path and I kept walking, one foot in front of the other, through the dust and the heat and the unending, beautiful, terrifying mystery of being alive. The sun broke over the horizon, a sharp, brilliant light that sliced through the shadows and illuminated the desert in a blinding, golden glare. I shielded my eyes, the sudden brilliance of the day making me realize just how long we had been moving, how much time had passed since the moment the world had turned into a series of flashes and thuds. We reached a ridge, the ground falling away into a valley, and below us I saw the base, a cluster of containers and concertina wire, the heart of our world, the place where we were supposed to be safe. It looked different from here. Small. Fragile, a tiny, insignificant outpost in the middle of a vast, indifferent landscape. I felt a surge of relief, a sudden, sharp, aching sense of return, and I realized that we were going to make it back, that we were going to survive another day, that the life we had left behind was still waiting for us, even if we were never going to be the same people who had walked away from it. I took a deep breath, the air hot and dry and tasting of dust, and I felt the weight of the rifle, the burden of my gear, the history of the last 2 days settling into my shoulders. I looked at Miller and he was staring down at the base, his face set in a hard, determined line. He didn't look at me. He just started the descent, his footsteps crunching on the loose gravel, his pace steady and purposeful. I followed him, the rest of the squad moving with him, a line of shadows descending into the valley. We were going back to the beginning, back to the routine, back to the life that had been interrupted, and I knew, even as I walked, that it was going to be the hardest thing I'd ever done. We were going back to a place where we were supposed to be the same, where we were supposed to be the ones who had left, but we weren't. We were the ones who had seen the other side, the ones who had stared into the void and had been changed by it, the ones who would carry the weight of that alleyway and that lopsided, effortless grin until the end of our lives. I felt the toy in my pocket, the smooth, wooden weight of it, and I realized that it was more than a relic. It was a promise, a testament to the fact that we had been there, that we had survived, and that we were never going to be the same again. The descent felt like it took forever, the sun rising higher, the heat becoming more intense with every step. My legs were screaming, my body was giving up, but I kept moving, the rhythm of the squad carrying me forward. I wasn't thinking about the mission, or the patrol, or the war. I was thinking about the first thing I would do when we got back. I would take off my boots, I would wash the dust off my skin, I would sit on my cot and listen to the silence of the tent, and I would try to breathe, just for a second, without the weight of the last 2 days pulling at my chest. I reached the fence, the concertina wire glinting in the light, and I saw the guard at the gate, a kid with the same wide, innocent eyes that I remembered from my own first days. He looked at us, his face a mixture of curiosity and caution, and I realized, with a sudden, sharp pang of recognition, that he was the mirror of the version of me I had left behind. I wanted to tell him, to stop him, to warn him of what was coming, but I didn't say a word. I just walked past him, my face a mask of stone, my eyes fixed on the entrance to the tent, my spirit somewhere far away in the dust and the shadows in the place where the Mercy had lived. I entered the tent, the air inside cool and still, the scent of stale sweat and old coffee a strange, comforting embrace. I collapsed onto my cot, the weight of my gear dragging me down, and I let out a long, shuddering breath that felt like it had been held for a lifetime. I didn't want to think. I didn't want to feel. I just wanted to be still, to let the world stop, to exist for a moment in the silence that had been missing for so long. I felt the toy in my pocket, the smooth, wooden surface cool against my hand, and I pulled it out, looking at it in the dim light of the tent. It was nothing, really, a piece of wood, a fragment of a life I would never know, but it felt like a mountain, a stone from the grave of my old self, a reminder of the things that were too heavy to be carried alone. I sat there, the toy in my hand, the quiet of the tent surrounding me, and I realized that this was it. This was the end of the beginning, the moment when the war stopped being a place we went to and started being a part of who we were. I closed my eyes, the sound of the camp outside feeling like a distant, irrelevant hum, and I finally, for the first time in my life, let the tears come. They didn't make me feel better. They didn't wash away the blood or the memories or the weight of the things I had seen, but they were mine, a small, honest part of a life that was still, somehow, stubbornly mine. The rest of the camp woke up around me, the sound of engines starting, the rhythm of the day beginning, the machine cranking itself back into motion. I ignored it. I stayed on my cot, the toy still in my hand, the weight of the last 2 days sitting on my chest like a leaden shroud. I heard Miller come into the tent, the sound of his heavy boots hitting the floorboards, but I didn't look up. I heard him take off his gear, the clatter of his rifle against the frame, the sound of a man letting go of the tension that had been keeping him alive. He sat on his cot, the one right across from mine, and for a long, quiet minute, neither of us said a word. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, thick with the things that couldn't be spoken, the shared weight of a secret that was too big to be contained by a room. He looked at me, his eyes tired, his face marked by the same exhaustion that was etched into my own, and he nodded, a slight, slow movement that was both an acknowledgement and a question. I nodded back, that was all. We didn't need to say it. We didn't need to name it. We were both here, we were both survivors, and we were both, for better or for worse, the men who had lived through the day when the sky had fallen and the world had ended. I fell asleep eventually, the exhaustion finally overriding the chaos, the darkness in my mind replaced by a dreamless, heavy void. I didn't wake up until the afternoon, the heat inside the tent having reached a level that made the air feel like it was being baked. I sat up, my head pounding, my body feeling like it had been bruised from head to toe. I walked outside, the light blinding, the world still, the hum of the bass a distant, persistent drone. I found my way to the mess tent, the smell of cooked food hitting me like a physical force, the sight of the guys eating, laughing, talking like nothing had happened, feeling like a scene from a movie I didn't understand. I grabbed a plate, the food tasteless and dry, and sat down at the end of a long, folding table. I watched them, the way they moved, the way they laughed, the way they kept the rhythm of their lives, and I felt 1,000,000 miles away, a ghost haunting a room of the living. I was a survivor, yes, but I was something else, too, something darker, something heavier, something that had seen the way the world worked and had been permanently, irrevocably altered by the knowledge. I looked down at my plate, the food a gray, unappealing mass, and I realized that I wasn't hungry. I wasn't anything. I was just a vessel, a container for the things I had witnessed, the things I would have to carry home and fold into the rest of my life like a secret that could never be shared. I saw a guy from another unit, someone I barely knew, laughing at a joke, and I felt a sudden, sharp wave of jealousy so intense it was like a knife in my gut. I wanted to be him. I wanted to be the guy who could laugh at a joke, the guy who could think about tomorrow without a sense of dread, the guy who hadn't stood in the dirt and watched a brother stop breathing. But I wasn't him. I was the guy who had seen the truth, the guy who had been marked by the experience, the guy who would carry the weight of that alleyway until the day I died. I stood up, left the plate unfinished, and walked out into the heat, the desert stretching out in front of me, a vast, indifferent ocean of sand. I went to the back of the base, where the concertina wire met the open desert, and I stood there, looking out at the horizon. The sun was beginning to dip, the sky turning that same familiar shade of bruised purple, and I felt the familiar, gnawing ache begin to creep back into my chest. I reached into my pocket and touched the toy, the wood smooth and cool under my skin, and I thought about the kid, about the way he had walked away, about the way the world had continued to turn despite everything. It was a cycle, a relentless, unfeeling machine, and we were all just parts of it, small, insignificant cogs that were being ground down by the pressure of our own actions. I felt a sense of clarity, a cold, hard, unyielding truth that made the rest of the world seem like a distraction, a thin, superficial layer of reality that was covering up the real, brutal nature of existence. I was here, I was breathing, I was standing on the edge of the world, and I was going to carry the weight of this for as long as I could. That was the truth, that was the confession. And as the night fell and the desert turned to black, I stood there, a shadow in the dark, waiting for the next day to begin, and I knew that no matter what happened next, no matter how much the world changed, I would be here, I would be standing, and I would be carrying the ghost of Henderson until the very end. The flight back was nothing like the movies. There were no cheers when the wheels touched down on American soil. just the rhythmic, metallic thud of a landing gear hitting the tarmac at a base in North Carolina, and the sudden, jarring realization that the sky above was blue instead of the constant, dusty, orange haze gray I'd memorized for months. We sat on that C-17 for hours, knees pressed against the steel walls, smelling of stale jet fuel and the lingering metallic scent of the desert that had settled into our skin like a stain that soap couldn't reach. I kept looking at my hands, waiting for them to stop shaking, but they just sat there, heavy and useless, resting on my duffel bag. We didn't talk. We just stared at the bulkhead, each of us locked in the same private theater, replaying the exact moment the world had snapped in half. When they finally opened the ramp, the air that rushed in was thick with humidity and the smell of cut grass, a clean, sharp, aggressive smell that felt like an intrusion. I stepped out onto the concrete, and for a second my knees buckled, not from fatigue, but because the ground felt too solid, too permanent, as if the earth itself had decided to stop shifting under my feet. I didn't want to see anyone. I wanted to go into a room, turn off the lights, and stay there until the memory of Henderson's face stopped being the first thing I saw when I blinked. But my sister was there. She was standing by the chain-link fence, wearing a bright yellow dress that looked like a scream against the drab, gray uniform I was still wearing. When she saw me, her face did that thing, the one where your heart breaks and mends at the same time, and she started running, her hair whipping in the wind. I stood there paralyzed, the duffel bag feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. When she hit me, she was small and warm and smelled like lavender laundry detergent, and the contrast was so violent it almost knocked me backward. She was sobbing into my chest, calling my name, telling me she knew I was coming home, telling me everything was okay now. I stood there, my arms hanging at my sides, my palms flat against her back, and I felt nothing but the terrifying, hollow space where my own joy used to live. I was home, but the part of me that knew how to be that person, the guy who walked away from her a year ago, hadn't made it back. The first night in my parents' house was the hardest thing I'd ever done. The kitchen smelled like pot roast and old paper, exactly like it had since I was 5, and the silence of the suburbs felt like a physical weight. Every sound, a floorboard creaking, a car passing on the street, the hum of the refrigerator, made my pulse spike, my eyes scanning the windows, my muscles coiled for a threat that wasn't there. I sat at the kitchen table, a cold glass of milk in front of me, listening to my father ask about the food over there and if the locals were friendly. He meant well. He really did, but every word he said sounded like it was coming from a different galaxy. I watched his mouth move, watched the way the light hit his graying hair, and I felt a surge of cold, bitter distance. How could I tell him? How could I explain that the world he lived in, where people walked to the mailbox and argued about the neighbor's fence, was a fairy tale? I lied. I told him it was fine, that it was mostly routine, and I felt the familiar burning prickle of shame behind my eyes. I was a stranger in my own home, a ghost haunting the dinner table, eating meat I didn't want while carrying a secret that was slowly eating me alive. The weeks that followed were just a slow-motion car wreck. I tried to go back to the way things were, but the grocery store felt like a minefield, and the local bar was a place where I sat in the corner, nursing a beer until the noise became too much and I had to leave, the breath hitching in my chest like I was underwater. I'd be driving down the road, the radio playing something familiar, and suddenly I'd be back in the alleyway, the sun-baked dust coating my throat, the sound of the mortar hit turning the world into a ringing, white-hot void. I'd pull over, heart hammering, sweat soaking through my shirt, and sit there in the dark until the shaking stopped. One afternoon, my girlfriend, the one who'd sent the letters I'd held onto like a lifeline, sat me down on the porch. She told me I was changing, that I was somewhere else, that she couldn't reach me anymore. She was crying, her hand on my knee, and I looked at her and realized I couldn't even remember what it felt like to love her. I loved her, I knew that, but the love was buried under a pile of rubble so deep I didn't think I'd ever dig it out. I didn't say anything. I just stared at the lawn, watching the way the wind moved the grass, and felt the distance between us turn into a canyon I didn't have the map to cross. The VA was a beige-walled nightmare of flickering fluorescent lights and men who looked just like me, hollow-eyed, restless, sitting in chairs they didn't really occupy. I went 3 times. The first time, a guy with a soft voice and a clipboard asked me what I felt. I told him I felt like I was still standing in the dirt. He wrote something down and suggested a group session, and I walked out and didn't look back for 6 months. It wasn't that he was wrong, it was that he was too safe. He didn't know the smell of burning diesel in a desert heat that melted the tread off your boots. He didn't know the look of a friend's eyes when they finally turned toward the floor. I started spending my time at night in the garage, cleaning things, organizing tools, moving boxes from one side to the other. It was the only time my brain would stop screaming. The physical order of it helped. If I could keep the world in rows, if I could make sure the wrenches were in the right place, maybe the rest of the chaos would stay on the other side of the door. I started having these moments, rare but sharp, where I'd catch a glimpse of someone who reminded me of Henderson. Maybe it was the way they walked, or a specific, lopsided grin when they were laughing at something stupid, and for 5 seconds the sun would come out. I'd feel a genuine, honest joy, a sense of belonging to the human race, a pride in the fact that I'd been part of something that had real, unvarnished substance. And then the memory would catch up. I'd remember the litter, the tearing canvas, the way the light hit his dog tags, and the joy would turn into that sick, rising pressure in my throat. I'd be standing in the middle of a parking lot, laughing, and then I'd just stop, my breath catching, the world turning gray again. It was a cycle. I'd pull away, sink back into the silence, and tell myself that this was just how it was going to be. Survival wasn't a destination. It was a long, slow climb through the dark, and some days you just didn't have the strength for it. But then things started to change in ways I couldn't map out. It wasn't a sudden healing. There was no light at the end of the tunnel, just the tunnel getting a little wider. I got a job at a small machine shop just outside of town. The work was precise, lathes, drill presses, heavy steel, and it required every bit of my attention. My boss was an old guy who didn't ask questions, just pushed a heavy broom my way and told me to get to work. He didn't care about my past, and I didn't care about his. We just made parts for engines, hour after hour, the smell of oil and metal grounding me in the present. It was quiet, steady work, and slowly, the garage stopped being a sanctuary and started being just a room. I began to sleep through the night, usually, and when I did wake up, I didn't immediately check the exits. I just laid there watching the dust motes in the morning light and felt the weight of my life resting on my chest, not like a shroud, but like a part of me that I was learning to carry. I still have the toy. I keep it in a small box on my dresser, next to my watch. Every now and then, when the silence gets too loud, I pick it up. I run my thumb over the wood, feeling the places where the child who carved it had worked the grain, and I don't feel the rage anymore. I don't feel the shame, not really. I just feel the gravity of it. I feel the sadness, deep and wide as a river, and I let it sit there. I don't try to hide it. I don't try to fix it. It's a part of the landscape now, a valley in the mountains of my life, and that's okay. I learned that you don't come back from a place like that and find the life you left waiting for you on the porch. You build a new one. You take the pieces you have left, the ones that didn't shatter, and you start putting them together one day at a time until you have something that stands on its own. It isn't the same. It's scarred, and it's quiet, and it's harder than it ever used to be, but it's mine. I'm telling you this now because the silence finally feels like a choice instead of a prison. I spent years thinking that if I let the truth out, the weight would crush me, but I realized that it was the keeping of it that was doing the damage. I'm not asking for forgiveness, and I'm not looking for a pat on the back for still being here. I'm just saying it, finally, to someone who isn't standing behind a desk or wearing a uniform. I'm a man who went to a place that wasn't meant for him, and I did things that can't be taken back, and I lost things that can't be replaced. But I'm standing. I'm working at the shop. I'm looking at the trees in my yard, and they're turning that deep, beautiful orange again, and for the first time in 10 years, I can actually see them. I don't know what tomorrow brings, and I don't know if the dreams will ever stop coming, but I've got work to do in the morning, and the coffee is hot, and the porch light is still burning. I went out on the back deck this morning before the sun was fully up. The air was crisp, that kind of cool, biting morning air that reminds you that the seasons are still turning, regardless of what we think of them. I sat there with my coffee, watching the fog lift off the creek, and I saw a red-tailed hawk circling high above the tree line, banking against the wind without a sound. It looked so steady, so completely at home in the vast, open space of the morning, and for a heartbeat, I felt that same stillness in my own hands. I didn't check the perimeter. I didn't scan the shadows for a threat. I just watched the hawk until it disappeared into the trees, and I realized I wasn't waiting for the end of the world anymore. I was just a man, on a deck in Ohio, in the quiet of a Tuesday morning, and that was enough. The last thing I realized was that the weight I've been carrying wasn't there to bury me. It was there to keep me anchored to the only truth I'll ever have.